there needs to be like a massive program of forced desegregation. If you don't want to live with black people, guess what? We're gonna force you. We're gonna force you to do it. We're gonna do some of those Stalinist population transfers, but for the good. And we're not gonna kill anybody in the process, but we're gonna force you to live with each other. You know what? I think the most American kids are the Italian kids. It's not a coincidence that as a 7, 8 year old from Russia, here I am thinking these are the American kids and I'm not. Alex, go make an effort to sit at the all black table during lunchtime, right? Don't do the comfortable thing of sitting with some of the Russians, just like do this thing. But there's this, just like in America, we had this like virtue signal of freedom,
Mm.
freedom, freedom. The Soviet virtue signal was at least we don't treat black people like
Yeah.
this. And there were a lot of strange things happening. Like, for instance, when I was born, I had 6 fingers and 6 toes.
Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel where we talk about American identity and family stories. And believe it or not, I majored in Russian literature and Soviet history and language as my undergrad. I took a lot of classes on different cultures, but I was just so fascinated by the Soviet Union, everything Russian, and I love Dostoevsky. So I was really interested in talking with Alex. Alex grew up in Brooklyn, but he was born in the USSR. I'm interested in talking with Alex about the Americanization of Russians. Are Russians white? Yeah, so I'm really excited. If you like to watch this ad free and support the work I'm doing, please join me on Patreon at NYTN. Otherwise, let's go say hi to Alex.
My name is Alex Sheremet. I am an author and filmmaker in New York City. I was born in Belarus, then the USSR, but I've lived in New York City most of my life. Thank you, Danielle, for having me, and I look forward to this conversation, not only about Russianness, but I guess the kind of wider perspectives we could all kind of take, I guess, depending on which continent you're from and how these things really shape shift over time, which is a common theme in your channel. So looking forward to the discussion.
Are you still in New York right now?
Yeah, I'm in New York City. I'm in Queens now, actually. I live in I guess you don't know the neighborhoods, but I'm around Jamaica, New York.
Okay.
So like I'm in the far side of Queens. And I mean, we'll be talking about race. I am like I got this house about 8 years ago, but I'm still pretty much the only white person here. I thought more would be moving in, but I remember when I had like some Russian friends come by from high school from like a long time ago.
Yeah.
They were nervous walking down the neighborhood. So this is another thing. It's like you could still be in New York City and still have the wrong idea about all kinds of places and still be nervous around others, which didn't quite hit me because it's like we went to the same school. It was a majority black school. It's like I don't expect these people to be anxious around groups of black guys. It's
Right.
like you've been around this for your whole life, but
Right.
it happens, and that we could talk about that when we discuss like the Russian aspects to like racial categories and the kinds
Can't
of
wait.
biases that exist there. So
I can't wait. Yeah, I'm super excited. And you immigrated here. Tell me what you remember as a little boy about that time of leaving. If you do, were you maybe 5 or 6? I'm trying to remember what you've
yeah,
said on that.
I started first grade actually in New York City. So before that, I was in Belarus. I was in a city in Belarus, and the main reason why we decided to go was in 1986, right? There was the Chernobyl meltdown, and the majority of the fallout actually went into Belarus. It was not in Ukraine. Most of it did end up in Belarus. And there were a lot of strange things happening. Like, for instance, when I was born, I had 6 fingers and 6 toes. You could sort of see a little bit of flesh in my hand here. I had like weird, health problems, that sort of thing. Hard to say exactly how much of this was from Chernobyl. I know there were a lot of mutations and things like that in the hospital where I was born. I know that recently there's been sort of like scientific like debunks of no, some of this wasn't happening, but honestly, based on just kind of what I heard and the experiences that people had, there was probably something going on. In
Yeah.
retrospect, that wasn't like the biggest issue, uh, but we didn't know it at the time, right? I mean, Soviet authorities were kind of tight knit about that. They were secretive about what was going on. We didn't quite know what was happening. And then after the collapse of the USSR, that was really when the decision was finalized that we have to go. And so 6 years old, I started first grade here, did not know any English, right? Had to learn English from scratch. And I'd say the most strange thing about it is by the time that I was in second grade, I was thinking, it's odd to me that people can't speak English. Why can't you, like, and just like a year before, I didn't know English, right? So people just learn language very, very quickly, just being around others, right? I remember by second or third grade, I was more or less fully fluent. Even there were like kind of like lingering things like, whenever I would say two, for instance, it was like two, two, two. So sometimes kids would make fun of me, be like, two, two, two. But being in New York City, like you could make fun of anybody back, right? Because everybody's an immigrant.
Right.
Everybody had their own little dialects, their own little things going on. So, that's like when we get to questions of like growing up, what are their biases against you? Well, in New York City, everybody has a bias against everybody, but they're all in one spot. So this plays out very differently than in some, maybe rural sections or, places where in groups and out groups are just much more defined, right? So,
That's right. That's right. I'm like blown away. I feel like your story is already one of the most fascinating ones I've ever heard. Thank you for sharing all of this. I think, like I said, before we went on here, I'm not from the city. I'm from like 90 minutes north of the city, but I had a very similar experience of my street that I lived on. Now looking back, it was filled with immigrant families. The people across the street from us were from Greece. My best friend next door, they were from Pakistan, like from Pakistan. And it wasn't like a thing, but the immigrant experience has never stopped here in the United States. I think a lot of people have this idea of like, well, your family either immigrated in the 20s or they're coming over illegally right now. Like it's that or that. Your family came in the 1990s. Can you kind of walk through their process of coming
um,
to the United States? What do you know about it?
well, the process, I'm actually going to leave the specific details, what I sometimes term the grim details of some of these portions of my life, probably like leave it in a book. But to make a
Oh, sure.
long story short, immigrating from Russia or Belarus at the time, uh, it basically had to be done in coordination with, tons of like corrupt, like, Russian officials, that sort of thing. By the time that we got here, we were undocumented. So I remember early on knowing that I didn't technically have my papers, and it was still up in the air whether or not I would have a green card. I was always nervous, like there was like a knock on the door. And still to this day, honestly, like still there's like a knock on the door. My immediate knee-jerk response is one of, I wouldn't call it danger, but there's like a slight anxiety of, oh, someone's coming to get me, right? Because I'm not supposed to be here. Honestly, like a lot of things, and this kind of plays into, I guess, wider experiences in my life where just certain things playing out a certain way, having experiences that are very kind of rich and rare. I think, why am I even here in the first place, right? So many others did not make it. Like there's this kind of politically correct perspective on immigrants where immigrants who come here, right, they do tend to be a little bit more educated. They tend to be, it's immigration has a bottleneck effect, as I'm sure where if you happen to be someone that's kind of like a go-getter or more educated, have physically the means to, move out of a place to a new country, that kind of selection process creates a bottleneck effect. Russians are on average in America, they're more educated. So when you look back on some of these experiences, it's very easy, especially if you're kind of a social climbing type. It's very easy to just look at that and present yourself as a kind of victim, right? Like, oh, poor Alex, right? He was here undocumented and he was scared as a child. He grew up around, the fallout in Chernobyl. He had to do these like, dangerous, corrupt deals, and his family was in physical danger in Belarus and what like uh the fact is like that is so far behind now, isn't it? Right? I'm in America now. I have a totally different set of experiences. I consider myself an American. I'm not going to go around virtue signal as some sort of immigrant victim. And first of all, the real victims are the people that stay behind, right? Secondarily, I'm pretty sure that many of the immigrants that are kind of from, middle upper class types and whatnot, they probably are aware of the fact that they're not victims themselves. Because I remember having this conscious thought when I was in high school and I was doing the, college application essays. I remember rather guiltily, I was kind of feeling guilty as I was doing this, but I was crafting the entrance essay as something along the lines of, and I grew up in all these, in this like Soviet, like former satellite of the Soviet Union. And it's like, give me a break. Like, I'm in a majority black high school with kids with life outcomes, sometimes far worse than people even in, these post-Soviet republics, right? I don't really get to play this kind of victim. So I'm very hyper vigilant of seeing immigrants, especially other Russians, play up to any kind of, type, any kind of like, poor me. You should feel, in fact, lucky and fortunate being where you are, and you should understand what your position in society is. Immigration does in this way does lend itself to kind of narcissism. If you're going to be able to freely, right, not as a refugee, but freely up and go somewhere, that already, again, as I said, it's a selection process. So I try to be very aware of this fact.
I mean, I guess we could just jump in. The Americanization process is something truly, it's new to me. I don't think I've ever really looked at it through that lens in school. That's not how I was taught to look through it. And I have really enjoyed looking through that process. I think sometimes we conflate Americanization with maybe racism and things like that. But it's like you're saying, the Russian experience was a certain way. And then we have other groups of people who are still having other experiences here in the United States who've been here longer. Can you speak on what it meant to you to become American, the Americanization process, even for Russians? I don't know how comfortable you are speaking for like a group, or
Mhm.
maybe what you've seen, but
Well,
I'm
yeah,
curious on that.
I could speak about, I grew up also around Russians, and also let's just get into the specific thing of just even calling myself Russian. I mean, technically, I was born in Belarus, but I don't remember anybody in Belarus speaking the Belarusian language. Now that has changed since, right? Because Soviet repression of language and whatnot, that's not there anymore. But I consider myself Russian largely because I grew up speaking Russian, right, as my only language. And I've actually known other, let's say, so-called Russians, like people born in Kazakhstan, somebody that I went to high school, for instance, that I met up with recently, and we started talking about the immigrant experience. And he told me that I asked him, so you went back to Russia a few times. You ever go back to Kazakhstan? He was like, oh, never, never. Like totally, like just kind of dismissive, like that. Because first of all, I mean, he's pale skinned like me, right? So ethnically, we are probably Muscovite, right? Going back further, and of course, going back further, probably like Nordic of some sort. And he told me that when he was growing up, he felt ashamed to be a Russian or to be associated with that. And it's kind of funny to think about because I can't name any specific process going on in New York City, for instance, that would ever make me feel ashamed. That never happened, right? There was no teachers, right? To the extent that, there might be kids teasing you. But again, being in New York City, there's a Chinese kid next to me. There's a Colombian kid next to me. There's a kid from another Soviet republic. Like we all tease each other. It's not a big deal. So none of that really mattered. But still, there was this, ever-present, all-powerful process of conformity. And this applies to everybody. This applies even to the native born. I've talked about this on my channel before, and I've asked this question. Isn't it so odd when you look at the way that Black Americans have been treated and still are treated? Isn't it crazy that there is no armed, supermassive militant movement that would be justified in existing, but that doesn't exist? They've all been assimilated in this kind of idea that we're going to really, really, like fight against this or that in this kind of extreme way. That's not part of it. Same thing with, Native Americans and Indian reservations. Shouldn't there be like a massive armed movement of Native Americans right now trying to take what's theirs? They wouldn't be totally unjustified. But that doesn't exist. There's still, even in like reservations, there's a strong assimilationist drive that exists there, and it's very imperceptible. Like I remember, for instance, once when my mother was trying to teach me to like really learn Russian like formally in terms of like writing, reading, and all of that. And I became so upset at that when I was it must have been like 7 or 8 that we had like a globe, you know, when there was like spinning globes,
Yeah.
and I took like a marker and I started like erasing Russia, you know, off the globe. I was like, what is this? I hate that this place exists, that I have to be forced to like I don't know like learn the language as opposed to like play video games and whatnot. But by the time that I was a teenager, then I entered college. I had this like huge block of time in between classes. So I got all these like Soviet language textbooks, like straight up like 1950s, 1960s. And I just learned how to like essentially read and write only in my late teens, early 20s. And I really regretted not doing it earlier because obviously the later that you do it, it's more difficult. Obviously, Russian is a much more difficult language than the majority of European languages, with the
Right.
exception of some of those like, you know, non-Indo-European things like Basque or, you know,
Yeah.
Hungarian or whatnot. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, so that was kind of it's like the presence of this, you know, this assimilation process that's always bearing down on you, but they do it in a way where you can't really complain because they're not saying anything bad to you, right? They're not forcing anything. It just happens, right? And these feelings just kind of percolate, and you're not really aware of them until much later in life.
I'm fascinated that you, like, as a teenager, wanted to go back and really formally learn it because I feel like that is such an American experience, even though you weren't born here. It is such an American experience of, I want to reconnect, I want to know, but kind of pushing it away. And there's this tension of we're holding on with one hand and we're pushing away with the other. And that like push pull to those ancestral origins, I think that to me is the most American thing. I think it's really interesting to hear you saying that. Can you tell me a little bit about, let's go back to Belarus, or to say broadly Russia, you know, I think people will probably want to parse out the nuance there, but you know, broadly, the Russian Empire, we we here are very binary in the United States with color. What is it like in your what I mean, you were a kid, but looking back, hearing family stories, understanding things, remembering things. What was it like in Russia? Does that binary exist? It can't exist really in the same way, right? The white black divide.
Yeah, well, for certain of these binaries, so like for example, for me, I have always considered anybody Russian that can speak Russian. So if you're like a black woman in Russia, and you know you just let's say came from Africa and you learned Russian fluently and you speak it even like you know better than me or whatever, I'm gonna consider you more Russian than myself, right? I think a lot of I think a lot of the fact of like what Russian is a language, I guess the difficulty of Russian, putting all this stuff together, it's hard for me to not consider someone Russian who's like had those experiences and had you know that kind of like linguistic upbringing, even if it's like later in life.
Yeah.
But I might be, you know, an exception in this case. Like one of the reasons why I really like went back to like Russian and stuff like that is I guess part of it is that, you know, push and pull that you describe, but because I am a writer and you know, I love literature, I love poetry. Yeah, I went back for the literature, right? I went back specifically for the poetry, not even for, you know, everybody loves the Russian prose writers. To me, it's the Russian poets that are the best when it comes to Russian literature. And so I went back partly for that reason. But in terms of like a color line, so let me give like one example that stood out for me. So I'm married. I'm married to a Korean woman, right? So she was born in Korea. I was born in the USSR. And I remember one time, like when I brought her home for the first time, and my great grandmother met her. She was like, "Oh, Alex, it's so wonderful that you finally brought home a white girl." Because I never grew up like, you know, dating white women because I was just not, it was just not really my circle of like friends. I was around like, you know, I dated, you know, black girls, Caribbean girls, like, you know, it was just kind of like a typical like New York City experience. And I brought her home and I was very surprised when she called her white. I was like, and then I was thinking, how okay, how do I explain this to her? So she was born in the time that right when Lenin died. She was born at total peasant society. And you know, she's not educated. So I'm like, all right, when she sees her, she sees that her skin is more or less as pale as mine or hers. So she views her as white. And I was like, well, she's not really white, right? She's Korean, right? She's Asian. She's like, what are you talking about? She's white. What do you mean? What else could she be? But there's also, there's a large like Korean population in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan at the time, USSR, right? There was a lot of back and forth with Korean migrants. For a while, Koreans were considered the good Asians because as they would come over to the Russian Far East after Russia procured some of their lands from, I believe it was China that had ownership of some of that land. So a lot of these Korean migrants came over and they were considered very good migrants in the sense that they did the work that Russians wanted them to do. They had, I guess, like some sort of like cultural understandings, but that also changes back and forth. Eventually, there were deportations of Koreans when it was thought that, perhaps they would not be as submissive to the Soviet state, especially if you had things popping off between, USSR and Japan. Later on, you had the rumblings of, the Sino-Soviet split, that sort of thing. So those things, even in the USSR, would be very malleable. There's this, just like in America, we had this like virtue signal of freedom,
Mm,
freedom, freedom. The Soviet virtue signal was at least we don't treat black people like this.
yeah, that's
And
right.
there is some truth to it. And I think we should be very aware of the fact that the Soviet system, historically speaking, for that part of, Eurasia, it's obviously like very progressive in terms of like what was done before, such as like the Russian genocides against the Circassians, that sort of thing. Like from my personal experience, when I was in my city in Belarus, it was pretty, from what I recall, pretty homogenous, right? So it
Mm,
was very surprising to go to New York City, not because of the feel, because there was still this kind of post-industrial feel in the 90s in New York City, especially in the places where I was living at. Um, but I was surrounded by very different kinds of people. And I remember I very consciously had to like be more and more comfortable. Eventually, by the time I went to high school, into majority black school, it's like, all right, like you have Alex, go make an effort to sit at the all black table during lunchtime, right? Don't do the comfortable thing of sitting with some of the Russians, just like do this thing. But little
mm.
by little, it's like the more that you have these experiences, the less that you're going to be nervous and anxious in these situations. So my experience is largely one of going from a homogenous place to one that was much more diverse. And I very much credit, so much of my worldview literally to just being like in the public school system. A lot of people don't really get that. They think when they talk about affirmative action as like, oh, like it's good for education because it provides a diversity of points of view. People think that's kind of like a woke virtue signal. It's not. Because if you are in the public school system, especially in a place like New York, you really, really know what the world is like. You know what people are like. You're not ever going to be allowed to be in some kind of bubble. And I very much love the fact that that was my experience into adulthood.
It was just a given. I grew up around lots of cultures, and it's interesting to me to see people feel uncomfortable because it's not because I'm better. It's just when you're a child and you grow up around a lot of different people, you think that that's normal, which it should
Yeah.
be.
This idea that there are people that are uncomfortable around others. Now, you mentioned something on your channel before where you're not, you don't have like a political home, right? You're not like typically, Republican or Democrat. Personally, like I'm in the far left, but a lot of people that call themselves in the far left, if they talk to me, they would think like, oh, this thing that he's saying is reactionary, or this thing is, sexist, or it's racist. But like for example, I would say the following. I think a large reason why people are racist, it does have to do with the biology, but not in the kind of like typical, a way that somebody like Jerry Taylor might present the situation. I think biology plays the following role. Human beings, they grew up, right, in terms of like, evolution, they were in places where it was very homogenous, right? Like if, let's say you're like in an African village, everybody around you, everybody looks like you have the same linguistic ticks. Maybe a village like 10, 20 miles over, that could be the outgroup. And
Right.
physically, you might actually look the same, but maybe linguistically, you're a little bit different. And if eventually what happens is human beings who have a really, their brains have developed to like, make in groups and out groups and to really sort of like hone in on differences. If eventually we get to the point where we travel far enough that our physical colors change, because we are visual human beings, you're gonna be just naturally nervous if you've never been around this group. Again, when I first moved to New York City, I was nervous being around kids of colors that I did not know they existed. But with enough experiences, not just experiences in general, but like specifically positive experiences, if you develop friendships with like non-whites or whatever it might be, or if you're a black person, you're developing, friendships with whites or whatever, the more of these kinds of interactions that you have, this biological impetus that we all have to create biases, to visually differentiate each other, to create all these massive, like the problem is we create a lot of salience out of things that biologically don't have salience, right? White versus black biologically, there's almost no salience there, but visually, we trick ourselves very easily. That's how the brain works. So I do think in terms of like reducing racism in America, there needs to be like a massive program of forced desegregation. If you don't want to live with black people, guess what? We're gonna force you. We're gonna force you to do it. We're gonna do some of those Stalinist population transfers, but for the good. And we're not going to kill anybody in the process, but we're going to force you to live with each other. And eventually you're going to see that, you know what, we are very much alike. That's literally the only way. You need positive, repeated interactions with people who are not like you. That's literally the only way. We are built for racism, not in the way that the racists claim, but in the much more nuanced way that I just described. I don't think there's anything scary in saying that. You just have to be very careful in what you mean.
What do you think about if we were comparing what we now call Russia and the United States? Do you think there could be any situation where that kind of protocol could work in Russia? Is that a thing that would need to happen where people are self-segregating in a way that needs to be mandated to be addressed? Do you think that that would work there? Do you think it needs to happen there like the US, or do you see it
I think
just
it probably
differently?
needs to happen everywhere. I mean, like to get back to the idea of like the Russian virtue signal, like I mean, most recently now, like USSR collapsed. Putin says, I miss it, but only an idiot would want it to return. A lot more room for negative stereotypes to take root. There's a lot more room for conflict. You're going to have fewer cities, like New York City, for instance. So I don't take like positions of this in the near term, but long term, I do envision centuries from now a more kind of like unified world with like a more kind of unified, if not government, then at least certain way of doing things and much less segregation. I think one of the best things would be if people could just literally be like, you know what, I want to move to Australia for 5 years and see what it's like, or to Africa, or to whatever might be in the Middle East. I think it's good if people are able to do that, but the only way that that's possible is if resources are evenly distributed. And with that, right, all these fears tend to go away. So I am a fan of forced desegregation, not because I don't think there's going to be a lot of chaos that ensues from that in the near term, but it's like we have chaos right now.
Yeah.
Like you're just stating a preference for one type of chaos over another because one chaos doesn't touch you while it's touching somebody else. So I don't really buy some of these, faux liberal arguments when it comes to stuff like this. And
I'm
that's the thing.
fascinated by this. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
And when it comes to liberals, that's another thing. The people that are virtue signaling the hardest about, inequality, racism, Black Lives Matter, they wouldn't be caught dead living in a black neighborhood, right? They wouldn't. I don't ever see any of these people, right? Where I go, where I live, where I've lived, I don't see any of these people. They will never ever be there.
Mm.
And like you could pontificate all you want about equality, but if you're not willing to like live somewhere where that's like you're gonna have to really test yourself and be in uncomfortable situations, I just don't buy that you would ever be a part of this desegregation process. You could say all that you want, all the words are nice, but the bottom line is, are you going to want to live in some of these neighborhoods and go through the difficult psychological process that that entails?
Well, I'm fascinated by this because, like you said, if you're far left leaning, I truly don't know if I'm anywhere on the line, because I agree with you that the more exposure we have to each other, the more open we are, and that's a thing we want to foster. But I never feel like we can legislate people's hearts and minds. Like we can put them in the position and want them to change,
Hmm.
but we're humans just like we're so terrible to each other.
Hmm.
And so that's where I think I disagree with a lot of people on the left, because I don't ever really think the government is going to make that change in people, even though I want it to work. I want it to work so much. And I loved how you're
Well,
talking about oh, go ahead.
do you think on that point, do you think if some of the resource distributions and opportunities change, that that would change? Because, for instance, what I'm saying is not, I want to force a little white boy that's never been around black people into the housing projects in East New York. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is repeated, reinforced interactions that are positive, right?
Yeah.
People, people around you that are not impoverished, right? That are kind of like, from your background, for example, people that don't have to resort to street crime. Because also, when we talk about crime, right, everybody always talks about street crime, but there's a far
Yeah.
deeper category of crime, right? When white people do crimes like in 2024, like it's not going to be street crime. You don't have to. You could be just become president and do a bombing campaign that's illegal by international law, kill hundreds of thousands of people, create millions of refugees, and you're never prosecuted. That's such a high crime. There's no amount of black on black crime that could happen that would ever equal what a single white president could do. So what I mean by that is, like, imagine repeated positive interactions between people, and the government is, that would be the entity that creates the resources to not like ensure that it's going to be 100% positive, but to maximize the chances, right? Like I don't think like we should like move into housing projects. I think that should be, sort of like taken down, and we need like a new model, for example, right? So I think
Yeah.
with the way that things are, it's very easy to imagine a situation where people just go into this melting pot and they're at each other's throats, but it doesn't have to be this way if the resource distribution changes. You know what I mean?
Again, I think the idealism is what I kind of would probably rally with the bleeding heart liberals, so to speak. But again, the government involvement, I think, is where I always think it starts off with good intentions, and it can it can get bad
Hmm.
fast. So I agree, like it needs to be solved. I hate how it is. I guess my
Hmm.
approach would be the real slow, steady burn of as America becomes more multicultural, as people begin to marry each other and stuff, the lines go away. Um,
Hmm.
which again might be idealistic, but that's kind of how
Yeah.
I've approached it.
I think sooner or later, whether it's by the very slow process of like people, people getting married to one another, like a lot of people are upset at migrants in America, but at the same time, like that's probably one of the main reasons why like we are always so robust. Like you notice, like when it comes to like world crises, we tend to be like whether it's like energy independence, whether it's like birth rate, whether it's like the labor force. We're much more robust than Europe. We're much more robust than China. We're much more robust than Russia. And a lot of this has to do with demographics. So I think like little by little, it's just inevitable that the world does get more mixed up in this way. I just think that it's very clear to me that government could definitely do things to put people in like more positive situations where because like you can't keep like penning people into like random neighborhoods, and this is like their whole existence. Like I remember when I was so I used to be a teacher. I remember one of the first places that I taught at was it was this school that it was an elementary school that was right off of the Coney Island housing projects. And it's like, every kid in there is a black, and there's a couple of Hispanic kids. And some of the mothers that would come to pick up their children, they'd be like, oh, yeah, I went to this school as well. And my mother went to this school as well. And it's literally like generation after generation after generation in the same segregated neighborhood. Nuances that you don't really understand unless you're really in it, right? Like when I
At America now, with your experiences, like who is American? Like who would you say is fundamentally American? How do we know if someone is American? Because I don't think we have that sense like a German might, where
Mhm.
they're ethnically German with the German language, and we're all and I know
Yeah.
that that's kind of glossing over things,
Mhm.
but
Well, it's funny that you asked that because when I was thinking about my childhood, one thing that I recall when I was like in second or maybe third grade, and I was reading, like it was one of those like American history textbooks, like in history class or whatever, and the question of like who is an American would come up, and we would talk about like Italian immigrants and whatnot, and I would just kind of sit back and I would look around the room, and there would be like kids from the neighborhood, and I would say, you know what? I think the most American kids are the Italian kids. I literally had that conscious thought. For whatever reason, I was like, yeah, the Italians are the ones that are American, right? I'm the foreigner. Like I thought, like, okay, I'm the foreigner. The Italian kids are the Americans. Of course, we know that that historically was absolutely not the case. Italians can't really like claim really like a lot of oppression. They can't claim discrimination. So they are totally Americanized. And it just shows you just by the sensitivity of some of these terms that are being used affectionately, like the middle, upper middle class, upper class, or whatever, the lobby groups that would represent all this, they're
Yeah.
so removed from this kind of experience that they don't even consider it like a worthwhile thing to entertain. And that just shows you how, like foundational Black Americans who've been here, much longer than Italians. They're obviously, at least in that specific metric, they're less Americanized. They're less allowed to be part of the body politic compared to Italians, which again, it's not a coincidence that as a 7, 8 year old from Russia, here I am thinking these are the American kids and I'm not.
That's absolutely fascinating to me. I feel like that could be a huge deep dive because I think you're gonna have a lot of people disagree with you, or they're gonna bring their personal stories, but the overview, the way that you're perceiving things as a kid, taking everything in. Um, I don't know. I almost could get emotional hearing that, and I don't know why. I think uh we just have a lot to work through in America. I don't know when we're ever gonna get to that point, but I love that people like you can come and you want to make our nation better. Like
Yeah.
I think that that's at the end of the day, if we could see that in each other, we may not like the routes different people have, but man, could we just come to the table and just talk about it a little bit? I think we get really
Yeah.
distracted by the way people want to do it instead of, okay, do you really, and like you said, there's a lot of people that say it and they don't really mean it. And
Yeah.
yeah,
And it's like an answer further because I didn't quite answer your question in terms of who I would consider to be American. Honestly, and again, I don't want to I want to be glib or this to be taken as a joke, but when I think back, I do really consider myself way more American than a lot of native born Americans, right? And there's a lot of reasons for this. Partly is because I did grow up in New York City, being around everybody, which I consider to be like, to me, like New York City is like one of the most American things in America, right? The existence of such a place, such an area, the fact that you could, interact with so many people and have all these different perspectives and have your mind change in so many different ways. That's very American to me. The fact that I was very assimilated and then, like relearned Russian and all of that, that's very American to me. The fact that, like it is like an American dream kind of experience. And like, I mean, even to this day, it's like right now, I am working on my first film. It's called From There to There, Bruce Ario, the Minneapolis poet. And I went with my colleague to Minneapolis last fall to basically get footage of the city and to like acquire like as much footage as I can related to the poet Bruce Ario. And he's totally unknown, but he's an American poet. And one thing that I do in the documentary is I emphasize the fact that this is an American poet, right? He's very, very American from his head to his toes. And I think it's kind of telling that I am drawn specifically to that. Like, yes, when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, I did literally take like 2 weeks off from everything. And I was just like reading nonstop, like, refreshing on like Russian history, Ukrainian history, Soviet, like, but I don't like, and I noticed like back then, I was like, you know what? If I really want to be like a total freak, I could turn this channel into a Russian explains everything about Russia, Ukraine, and just do that nonstop for 2 years. But I was like, I don't want to do that. That's like, it's not really me. It's not really my core interest. I want to present, and also like, but it's also in a way that's kind of countervailing to America because I feel like a lot of American values when it comes to like money or popularity, they would go that route. If they see a niche they could fit in, it's like, okay, business mind, let's go, so let's go. My more kind of collectivist, I guess, like Soviet mentality is one of I'm going to focus on things that are very worthwhile and important. Nobody knows who Bruce Ario is, right? He lived and he died. If I'm not doing this movie, there will be no movie done about him. But it's very important to get it out, and and I don't allow like, my old nationalisms or like feelings about Russia. I'm not going to allow these things to be a distraction to like higher, like transcendental values that I always want to clasp, I always want to clasp them and I always want to work towards them. Because in the end, I do envision eventually, the end of nation states and nationalism. I want, a world ruled by far more transcendental values. And to an extent, that's all. And like America is the best bedrock for this because we have the possibility for that much more than any other country on the planet. So I'm going to live it out, by not being some sort of, walking, talking Russian stereotype. I'm not going to turn myself into the Russian guy simply because I see an avenue for myself, right? I want to maintain the fact that, I am thankful being where I am. And because I have the opportunity, it's time to hit transcendence in the same way that Bruce Ario did, from homelessness, from drug addiction, from all of that, right? Becoming who he became, a great poet, even way above his identity. Like, great poet is the bottom line to me. Transcendental values beyond identity.
Just an aside, just because I'm curious so much about your point of view, and it's really interesting to me because I feel like what you're saying now almost seems like populist. We're kind of against what we've been presented as, but you do seem to have a innate trust in the government's ability to affect change. And I'm just wondering, like, how does that come together? What kind of government would that be then in your eyes that could come in and do that
Well,
here in the United States, even as we were talking about kind of maybe pushing integration more or something like that?
I mean, I don't even like, although like I grew up kind of as a Marxist, I don't try to like even put those kinds of labels because I know that there could be some sort of like long in between states. So it's like, all right, look, Alex, like, do you believe in reparations for Black Americans? The answer is yes. At the same time, I'm also aware of the fact that if we're going to do some sort of like lump sum payment, like most people that win the lottery, right? They like a lot of them end up going bankrupt because it's like they're not used to it. What I would want instead is a de facto reparations package where you have like a substantial government safety net, right? Social safety net where, everybody gets health care. Everybody gets a federal job guarantee doing very useful work, such as like, preparing for like the climate transition that we're going to have to need. Like learning like real skills, right, that they could be proud of. I would want there to be like I would personally I would ban all private schools, right? Everything has to be public. So rich kids, they have to go in school with the poor kids, and that means everybody's going to have to like pitch in. And like I've actually had models like that. I've taught in schools where you had kids from the housing projects, and you had
Mhm.
clearly kids from like I don't know Midtown Manhattan being taking the train down, and the rich parents would come in, they would give money to the school, and everybody's like standard of education and whatever in that school, it would be up. I want that kind of intermingling, and I would do it through a social safety net. Like we don't have to get to these like abstract concepts of like Marxism. Like, can we actually get rid of like profit? Is a profit motive actually psychologically useful in some way? Like, I don't even want to deal with that. Let's just get some of the most basic things on the table. I think honestly, if everybody has a federal job guarantee, if everybody has universal housing, meaning nobody can technically go homeless, and if everybody has universal health care, those three things alone would get rid of so many like social so much social disquiet, like very basic like old school stuff. And I think eventually we could start talking about these like more abstract fanciful notions of labor theory of value. Is it like I don't really care, like I used to care about that when I was a kid, when I was like growing up and I was like reading all those books, and it was so fascinating to me. But now it's like, all right, in the real world, let's get the core of these ideas, right? The humanity of Marx, right? The humanity of some of these philosophers, and just apply that to the world that we have. Because the thing is, like, Russia could have an excuse for doing some of the stuff that it does, but we have no excuse because we have the capability to give everybody everything that they need, right? We don't have fiscal austerity. We print money, into oblivion because we have essentially infinite credit. And maybe eventually that's going to come to a head, maybe not. But the point is, as long as credit exists, as long as it's, accepted, credit historically has always been treated as money. We have many
Mhm.
examples of this going back thousands of years. And not every country could do it. America can. The fact that America does not do it for the greater good, that's just disgraceful.
I think, and I want to make sure I'm respectful because I was going to keep this to an hour, but just two things I was writing down while you were talking about the
We could go for
reparations.
2 hours. It's fine.
Oh, I don't want to like, I think the reparations should be a different video if we do that, but I do want to agree with you that the way that we're spending money is disgraceful, corrupt. And I think if we're going to be spending trillions of dollars, it should be going back into the communities that need it here. Like I 100%
Hmm.
agree with you, however that works out. But I will say, as someone who I taught on the reservation, I've taught in charter schools, I've taught in the inner city, I homeschool my kids. I do not want to be told that they have to go to a certain school. I am so unhappy with the quality of education across the board. Private, I don't want them anywhere at that
Yeah.
stuff. And
And
they're
I think
in
that's the
things.
problem. Yeah, yeah, I agree. That's the problem. Like it's not even so much like that, oh, they're gonna force me to a public school. It's all those associations. We know public schools are like, we know what teachers are like, we
I
know
mean,
what
I've been
all
in
the
there. I've been in
yeah,
there. And
yeah.
the teachers, a lot of teachers were great. Some were terrible. They were allowed to keep
Hmm.
teaching. There was no help. I got paid dirt. You'd get kids were allowed to throw desks at me, things like that. My
Hmm.
husband finally was like, you have to quit because like it's not safe the way that this
Hmm.
is being set up. I love teaching.
Yeah.
I wanted to create the environment that I want for these kids, and it breaks my heart that that is it. But the reality is right now, as someone on the other side, and I know you're saying you taught as well, um, like I don't want my kids to be the guinea pig in the
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it could never work. But I this is where I do have that tension politically where I don't feel like it's a Republican thing. I kind of just want to be like left alone to do my own thing.
Hmm.
And I think that that's kind of where we see things differently. But I
And
think
that is a very American view, right? Whereas like,
right,
Russia is much more collectivist
communal,
even now,
yeah,
right? And I still have, that Soviet mentality. And part of this like is obviously like I did grow up like reading some of these like books, right? And I
yeah,
was like really into that stuff. But still, like, I have that collectivist mentality and I understand like why like the idea of like you thinking, okay, now I'm gonna send my kid to the school where they're gonna have tables thrown at them. I think as we like my model would be like as we liquidate like private schools, all those resources they have to be immediately poured in to schools, even if it's simple as like literally like double the number of schools and teachers just for 5 years, just to see what would happen, just to have much small class sizes. Because I mean, I know what you're
oh
talking about.
yeah, yeah,
I've been in schools where like I went straight up to like I would sometimes not even be in school teaching because I would be with kids going to their court appearances because they were in
oh
gangs, they
no,
got involved in
that's
stuff.
right,
It's like you got to do this, you got to do that. And it's like,
absolutely,
like, but the point is like, how did we, like the fact that, like, I understand you're saying you want to be left alone. Everybody wants to be left alone. At some level, like, I want to be left alone, obviously, right? I want to do my own thing. I want to just, all these transcendental values that I said, like, I wish I could just like lock myself somewhere. It's like all poetry, all film, and I don't have to deal with the dirt of the real world, right? Like sometimes when I do like political content on my channel, I feel so dirty because it's like I just
yeah,
want to get back to the poetry. But
yeah, yeah,
like to the extent that I want to be left alone, that is also like I'm very fortunate like to be able to be left alone, right? I mean, there is on the one hand like getting chairs thrown at you, but then there's also the fact that there's literally classrooms where whole groups of kids that look exactly the same. They will never ever learn to read by the time that they leave high
yeah,
school. Like there's kids
yeah,
like that. I remember being in high school tutoring some kids. I remember one time like we had like a history class and I was like, all right, she needs to write this essay, like not even that's like a paragraph on like World War II. And I was like, all right, let me sit down, tutor her. And I was like, all right, just write this first sentence. And she couldn't write it. And she was my age, right? We're both like 15, 16 years old. It's like, damn, like, how would I even be like, I was thinking if I was a teacher here, how would I even begin teaching her to write? Because she's illiterate, right?
yeah. No, the
And
system's totally broken. Like I agree with
yeah.
you. Like what we have is terrible. You shouldn't be able to keep getting moved through, but I guess again, the difference is for me, I always idealistically feel like the change can begin at home. But the problem is what happens when your home is not a safe place, is not a good place. And that
Yeah.
is where you're saying, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're like that's where the government steps in to create those third spaces, maybe, or create those places
Yeah.
for people.
Yeah,
And I
something very
don't know.
basic, like imagine like I told a lot of kids that were homeless. Like, sorry, that's going to be a major part of illiteracy, behavior
Yeah,
issues.
that's true. Yeah,
There should not be homeless kids in the school, right? Like that's just
no,
it's
I
just
agree.
common sense. You want them to be educated, don't make them be homeless. Like it's just like very like I would start with the very basics. Like we could even okay, Alex is dictator. We could hold off the liquidation of private schools. Let's just start with Let's just start with the fact that no child should be homeless, no child should be hungry, no child should not have health care, right? Like let's start
Yeah,
with like
I
every
agree.
child should have like a parent that has a federal job guarantee. Like start with the basics. Let's see how that works. And then let's keep moving forward. Because I mean, right now I am also very troubled by this like move towards like we are on a trajectory for privatization towards everything, especially schools. Like in New York City, it's supposed to be the most liberal city in America, right? And yet, Eric Adams, like he cuts hundreds of millions from the Department of Education budget. He sends that into the police budget. But guess what? The mere fact of cutting hundreds of millions from the education budget, in a few years, there's going to be kids that are gangsters literally because those cuts occurred. It's like a butterfly effect. There's going to be with
Yeah.
like enough kids, millions of kids, enough of these kids, that act of moving hundreds of millions of dollars somewhere else, that's going to cause many gangsters. It's just a fact of life. You have to be honest about that. Now, maybe crime won't be as high as it would be, but that's because the police force is now like reinforced. But the policing itself, it's also a regressive tax, right? Obviously, policing is better than no policing, but keep in mind that high levels of policing, it's a regressive tax in the sense that the most vulnerable communities that need the policing the most, they're the ones that also have to deal with the incidental issues related to it. Like when I was growing up, like all of my friends that were like, non-white, every single week they would have a story about being harassed by cops, being beat up by cops, being spit at by cops. I've never had that experience, and it's literally just because of my appearance, right? And we did the same thing. We were in the same groups, and like we were doing the same stuff, but I was not the one targeted. So, like again, I'm not one of these like defund the police in the sense that we could have zero policing, but you have to also remember that policing, even if it's the lesser of two evils, it is a regressive tax. And
Mm.
ideally, we want an equitable tax system, whether literally taxes or in this more kind of metaphorical sense.
What's interesting is I almost feel like when you're talking, correct me if I'm wrong, I almost feel like you believe in the goodness of people more than I do. Because I almost feel like
I no,
I don't feel like giving the government's already done such a terrible job with the money they've been given. The idea of giving them
mhm.
more power and money, I was like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah,
And I'm going to find
to me,
another
it depends on the
inroad.
programs, like it all depends on the programs. Like we used to have, like during the FDR era, right? Like the way that he got black votes, it wasn't by virtue signaling with a Kunta Kinte cloth, right? Kneeling down, or putting like a black box,
Yeah, that
right,
was
for
brutal.
BLM. The way that he
Right.
got black voters was he was like, all right, black people said that they believe Democrats and Republicans are equally racist, but I'm going to give them an economic program. I'm going to give them Social Security. I'm going to give them health care. I'm going to give them these additional rights. I'm going to give them jobs. And that's how it happened. Now it's like we have the history of that, but now it's like black people have to be beaten into line, right? So it's like you have to vote for us. You have to vote for us. Otherwise, this other guy's going to come. He's really going to like put you in concentration camps, right? So
Yeah.
what I would be very careful about, not just like I'm not like for the sake of government for its own sake. I want very specific programs. I want to see what you're doing. I don't see like good things being funded in the way that they should.
Yeah.
I just see terrible choices like again like cutting education means those kids they're going to become little gangsters because of where they're going up, right? Because they don't have this social safety net anymore. That's a problem. So I,
It's
I
so
I am
interesting.
fearful of people in that way. I am like fearful of people in the sense of like I know that that whole kind of concept of like civilization is a thin veneer. You could rip that
Yeah.
off, and underneath it, it's like pure animal like entropy. Like I accept that. I do believe that, which is part of the reason why I have some of these like pro government beliefs. But again, I say this as somebody that I have not voted for the two parties in a long time. I voted for
Yeah.
Obama in 2008. Sorry, that was once, too much for me. So like, yeah, it is true. I am a very contradictory person that way.
I
I
don't think
agree.
it's contradictory. I don't think it is. I think it's really nuanced. I think these are really important conversations because I think on paper, you and I, someone might say we wouldn't agree on anything. Like I'm a
Hmm.
Christian, right? That's my, I look through this lens of following Christ's teachings. I'm like, I want to love my neighbor as myself. I'm going to do all these things. And what does that mean? And kind of looking through this lens. And yet, and I think a lot of people will just assume, well, that means she's a Republican or she's a this or
Hmm.
she's against this or that. And it, again, the binary from black and white skin color, I think it translates over into the same political realm where we have put each other into these boxes where You and I have a lot. I think we agree on a lot. And I think
Hmm.
fundamentally, like you want things to be better here. You want the next generation to be better and you see a path forward. And I'm like, I really think we need more of that because I'm super tired also of just being pitted against people. Um, and we're not allowed to sit at the table and have a conversation and maybe respectfully disagree, but
Hmm.
like I think
Do you think that's
ultimately we do
changing?
agree.
Do you think some of that's
I
changing?
do. I
Because
actually do
I
think
feel like
it's
the pendulum is swinging back a little bit, you know?
I do. I do. I think people are like, you're mentioning Trump and Biden. I know these are kind of like the, people feel ways about those people, but most of us walking around, I don't think we hate each other the way that we have been told we hate each other. And I think at the end of the day, what I see is just absolute corruption in the government. Everybody wants to
Hmm.
stay in power. Everybody wants the money that comes along with it. And if we're fighting each other all the time over stuff instead of sitting down and having conversations, I think that's what we're missing. And so I am like so thankful to have this conversation with you
Hmm.
because there's a lot I agree. There's stuff I don't agree with or don't understand, but it's good for me to sit here and
Hmm.
think about it. And you gave me a lot to think about. Like you really, I've got like the crazy person notes. Uh,
I
going.
had many, many more notes. Maybe we could touch on that sometime later. But I think if I
I would
were
love
to
to.
like, if I were to really talk about like practical politics right now in terms of like stuff like voting, because I mean I do vote every time, even though I don't vote for the two candidates usually. I'm waiting for a candidate to come that gets zero support from corporations, because to me that's like a huge thing.
Oh
If we
yeah, yeah.
have if Clinton and Trump go against one another in 2016, Clinton gets about twice as much in corporate donations. When it comes to 2020, Biden and Trump are fairly equal when it comes to corporate donations. I'm sorry, but like when you get to the point of massive corporate donations, you're not going to be passing policies that are like pro-social. You're going to be passing pro-business policies, pro-big business policies usually.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
to me, that's kind of the bottom line. I was excited by the Bernie campaign simply because, I mean, here's a guy with like all small money donations, made something like about 100 million for his campaign. If he were ever to be like the Democratic nominee, one of the biggest like hindrance to him become president is not even like the specifics of like the policies or whether or not they would be popular. It's the fact that he would have, you know, the corporations that typically support Republicans or
Oh,
Democrats, both of them would unite to sink him, right,
crush
against
him. Oh
whoever
yeah,
the
for sure.
alternative would be. Really, that's kind of how it would really play out. So in terms
Yeah.
of voting, like I'm not against voting for either, even Republicans if it comes down to it, but show me a
Same. Yeah.
candidate that is not that gets zero in dollars from corporation and it's all
I agree.
small money donations. I would gladly support that person because most likely they will have the because if they're not being supported, right, it means they're probably doing something that a lot of these entrenched don't like. So
Yeah.
that's the way that I view it. Like I'm waiting for that candidate to emerge.
Yeah, I agree. And I think personally, I hate to even say, because like you said, I don't really have a political label. I agree. I'm liberal in this area. I'm more conservative in this area, and it just kind of how it shakes out. But in our house, actually, this is kind of a tangent, but we have stopped eating all processed foods. Like if it's made in the factory,
Mhm.
we're not eating it. And I was stunned. And this is new. Like it's a lot of work. Like I'm making the bread, the pasta, all the stuff we're eating. But
Mhm.
I was so horrified because I think support for these big companies is just shocking to me. So like these people are poisoning you. They
Mhm.
hate you. They just want to make
Mhm.
money. And this idea that big business is always good all the time. Capitalism is always whatever criminal capitalism, I would say.
Yeah.
Because I am capitalistic, but criminal capitalism,
Mhm.
I'd say here it's just shocking to me. I'm like, listen,
Yeah.
we have so much in common with people on the other side, but we have to just be okay putting some of these precious things down where we're saying, well, all big
Mhm.
business is so good. All this stuff is so good. I'm like, man, like I have been sucked in no way of stuff where I'm like, we need to
Mhm.
reassess, I think, really. And
And
like you're saying, people being supported by these big companies. I'm like, this is just a big scam. That's how I feel about it. I'm like, it's a big scam.
really slowly kill you. And we never talk about crime in that regard. Whenever we say crime, it's always street crime, which is like even in the worst case scenario, it's like what 20 to 25 1,000 at most murders every single year. That is such a drop in the bucket compared to like, I don't know, a CEO like, in some like little company somewhere decides to like dump waste into a river that's now there for 50 years and like nobody knows about it because it's a small town. It's not in the news. There's no like, Aaron Brockovich. There's nobody there. And it's like a town of like, I don't know, 30,000, like, by way of like this event by attrition, 5,000 of them or 10,000 of them die every generation. Imagine that, multiply that by like 1,000 times over and over and over and over again. So many places all around America and the world. That's really how human beings are dying. It's not like, you're going to get shot. That sometimes happens, right? But usually the people making those complaints, they're usually not, the people that are at most risk of murder anyway, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's fascinating. That's why I'm always open to hearing other perspectives, because I think a lot of the things I've held on to, you're buying it part and parcel, and you can't. You have to open the box, take the stuff out that is corrupt, and keep some of the good stuff, because I think both sides, if it's two sides,
Mhm.
there's good on both. And I think we need more of this. So thank you, Alex. You gave me so much, like really so much to think about. And yeah, I really it's been interesting. Your perspective is so interesting. So I really enjoyed this.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm glad that after watching some of your interviews, hopefully this has been the most wild one yet. So yeah, so we
Yeah.
delivered some top-notch entertainment for your
Yeah, I'm
audience.
sure.
But this was a very
Thank you.
nice conversation, and thank you for
I
having me
appreciate it.
on.
Thank you. And thank you for being so open and honest. And I think we need more of that, even if, we're not walking into a room with people who all have the same worldview as us. I think that's just as important. If people don't look the same or don't have the same worldview, we need more of that.